And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and I'm going to be making a video here really on the fly about just Magic the Gathering card design in general. I just finished watching a video. I didn't watch the whole thing because it was really long, but I was watching a video called The Dream is Dead, How Bad Card Designs Ruined Magic. It is an interesting watch. You can check it out. I'll put the link in the description. I don't agree with everything they said there. There was a lot that I did agree with. I think those guys mostly are playing other formats. They didn't talk about Commander that much. I'm going to give my 2 cents on the subject as a Commander player, right? And I don't play any other formats. So for me, the card design with regards to other formats, I mean, I totally get it. It sucks for those people playing those formats, maybe. I know a lot of cards get banned really, really quickly. That is something that, you know, as someone who used to play Standard for years and years and then played Modern for years, you just didn't see cards getting banned like right out of the gate like that. It usually took a while. So the fact that cards get banned super quick now it's interesting. But again, I haven't played any other format other than Commander for at least 4 years, I think. So I'm coming at this from the perspective of a Commander player. I encourage you to go check out that video, though. It is pretty interesting. They go over a lot of things. It's very long. It's almost 3 hours long if you can stick it out for that long. So for me, a couple of things that I really don't like, in particular, have a negative impact on the Commander format. And I talked about bad Commander design. I made a video a few months ago talking about the Commanders that I don't like the way they are designed. Here, I'm going to talk more about the 99 cards. I'm going to start out with something that they have mostly stopped doing, and I've brought it up in a couple of videos now, which is making Stacky effects, not necessarily stacks, but effects like that are non-symmetrical. I like symmetrical effects. Symmetrical effects make it so that you have to work around the problem as well, like a Winter Orb, for example, right? A Winter Orb affects everyone equally. That's a very powerful effect, but because it affects everyone equally, you have to work around the problem as well. And in fact, likely, if you're playing a Winter Orb, you're probably building your entire deck around it. I like that. It's a deck building challenge. They have in recent times started to get away from things that affect everybody and just only affect your opponents, right? So for example, Lavinia Azorius Renegade. Each opponent can't cast non-creature spells with mana value greater than the number of lands that player controls. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast to counter that spell. Both of these abilities only affect your opponents, right? If you look at a card like Gaddock Teeg, which is very similar and very comparable, both Commanders as well, non-creature spells with mana value 4 or greater can't be cast. Non-creature spells with X in the mana value can't be cast. Just everyone is affected by it. That's what I mean, right? Those two cards are a perfect comparison of Gaddock Teeg is the way they used to make cards. It affects everybody. It's a very powerful effect, obviously, and everyone is probably familiar with Gaddock Teeg in Commander, and a lot of people wouldn't love to see in the command zone, although it affects everyone equally. Your opponents have to build around this effect if they're building that deck as a Commander or in the 99. I'm okay with a Gaddock Teeg. It hurts everyone equally. I'm fine with effects like that. I don't love effects like Lavinia where you don't have to build around it at all because it only hurts your opponents, right? Drannith Magistrate is a perfect example of this and a card that a lot of people can't stand in the Commander format. Your opponents can't cast spells from anywhere other than their hands. This would be a perfectly fair card and a card that I would imagine a lot less people would have an issue with if it affected everybody. Not just your opponents can't cast spells, nobody can cast spells from anywhere other than their hands. And yes, it still kind of sucks because you can't cast your Commander. And yes, your opponents could put it in their deck where they don't plan on casting their Commander maybe. Sure, but again, now you got to build around it. Just like with a Winter Orb or any of those effects, you actually have to take it into consideration rather than I can just throw Magistrate in any Commander deck and hose my opponents and there's zero downside for me. I like cards where I actually got to put some thought into where I'm going to slot it in because there's a downside for me, right? Let's talk about Hull Breacher, a card that's banned in the Commander format. And I always find it interesting when a card is actually printed in a Commander set and then gets banned in Commander. So of course, Hull Breacher, very infamous card. I guess there's probably people that have only been playing Commander for a couple of years who probably aren't familiar with Hull Breacher because it's been banned for that long, right? So if an opponent would draw a card except the first one they draw on each of their draw steps, instead you create a treasure token. And I know people might think it's silly, but let's just imagine this card if it was symmetrical. Not if an opponent would draw a card, if anyone would draw a card except the first one they draw on each of their draw steps, you create a treasure token. So that means you can't do it either. That would make this card way more fair, and that would make this card I don't think it would be banned in the format, right? The scenario that everyone hates this card in the most is the wheel scenario, right? I cast my Hull Breacher, or I already have it in play, and then I cast a wheel. Well, if you wheel, what ends up happening, if this is a symmetrical effect, is everyone is going to discard their hands, and of course, no one's going to draw, including you. Now, you're going to get more treasures, but so what? Your can's empty. So that's not going to be very helpful. Now, if I have a scenario where, okay, I just want to create a zillion treasures so that I can use them for, maybe I got a Reckless Fireweaver in play. Okay, congratulations. You now have a 3-card combo that maybe wins you the game, right? That's great. I like that. I have no problem with that at all. That scenario is way more fair in the Commander format than the scenario where I wheel, the scenario that everybody wanted this card to be banned. I wheel, and not only do I get to refill my hand, but I get a ton of treasures as well. Just giving you a bunch of treasures is good, but it's not very good if your hand is empty, right? You have to build around that as well. So Hull Breacher, Drannith Magistrate, 2 cards that everybody absolutely hates in the Commander format. Both of those cards become way better and way more fair cards if they are symmetrical. They are more and more getting away from symmetrical effects in the Commander format, or just in Magic in general, which I don't like. I like the symmetrical effects because it makes you have to build around it. Expedited Inheritance is a great card that came out in Murders of Karlov Manor that is, it's not an asymmetrical stacks effect or a symmetrical, hate bears effect, but it is a symmetrical effect. And I sort of made a big deal out of this card in the video. I talked about it because, man, you almost never see effects like this in the game anymore. Whenever a creature is dealt damage, its controller may exile that many cards from the top of their library. They may play those cards until the end of their next turn. So this is what I mean. A symmetrical, everyone gets the benefit or everyone gets the downside. Either way, you don't see effects like that anymore. And effects like this, especially in the Commander format, where you have so many players, I think are even extra fun and interesting in that sort of gameplay. Similarly, the creatures with downsides is something, again, that I have talked about where they just don't really print creatures with, again, it's all upside. It's super easy to slot that creature in your deck because it's all upside. There's no downside. I mean, imagine Dockside Extortionist. I'll just throw that out there as an example, again, trying to keep this into the Commander format. Imagine Dockside Extortionist if it was, the black, you draw a card and you lose a life scenario, right? That's how you keep it in a box. You keep it from getting completely out of hand. If Dockside Extortionist, and it doesn't make a lot of sense, but just as an example, when Dockside Extortionist creates the treasure tokens, it deals a damage to you. That would be a more red effect, right? So just imagine that card that way. Dockside Extortion enters the battlefield, you create a treasure token, and you take 1 damage. Maybe that doesn't make sense flavor-wise, but nevertheless, I mean, it kind of does, because goblins do that, right? Goblins shoot themselves in the foot all the time. Maybe it deals 1 damage to all your creatures. That would make that card way more fair. Having drawbacks on creatures is really, really important. I didn't think they did the whole, this creature doesn't untap during your untap step anymore. I found one though. Depth Charge Colossus came out in Brothers War. Depth Charge Colossus doesn't untap during your untap step, and you have to pay 3 to untap Depth Charge Colossus. That's what I'm talking about as a drawback, right? It's all upside. Here we actually have a drawback. The whole doesn't untap during your untap step thing I hadn't seen in forever, but apparently this card came out in Brothers War. Now, that being said, it is a common. I imagine probably nobody plays this card. Chained Brute is another one I found from Jumpstart. 1 and a red, Devil 4/3. Chained Brute doesn't untap during your untap step. Of course, it's a 4/3 for 2 mana, right? So that's what I'm talking about. And I like that because now you got to build around it, right? Pay 1, sacrifice another creature, untap Chained Brute, activate this ability only during your turn. So it is a 4/3 for 2 mana, but it has that drawback. And I like the drawbacks. Yes, you're getting some nice upside, some nice advantage, but I got to work around this problem, right? Working around problems is an important part of deck building in Magic, and getting rid of the downsides makes it way too easy to shoehorn cards into your decks. And that's part of the problem why we run into having all these auto includes, at least in the commander format, right? Having those big drawbacks on the upkeep, again, is something I've brought up that we don't see much anymore, right? Like Apocalypse Demon, I think, is one of the most recent cards from Hour of Devastation. They don't really do this much anymore, right? At the beginning of your upkeep, tap Apocalypse Demon unless you sacrifice another creature. You see this from time to time. Very rarely, though, will you see the big demon that is sacrificing your other creatures or has some drawback like that. Some upkeep effect. That's used to be what the upkeep was for. The upkeep was literally for paying upkeeps for stuff, and we don't really see the upkeep used for that anymore. Argenta Masticore came out in Phyrexian will be 1. Being your upkeep, sacrifice it unless you discard a card. But of course, the discard a card is an upside. It's actually not much of a downside. I guess it kind of is a downside because if you don't discard anything, you lose your creature. But I put Argenta Masticore in my decks for the fact that I could destroy permanents with it, right? I've talked about in the past Kuru Pitlord, which I have in my Name is One deck, which I believe, I haven't found one yet. This is from Champions of Kamigawa, and I believe it is the last card ever printed that actually has a pay mana upkeep cost. So you actually, again, that was sort of the intention in the beginnings of Magic. At the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice Kuru Pitlord unless you pay 4 black. This is an incredibly powerful creature, even in the commander format with all the busted creatures we have. It's a 9 mana 9/9. So it's a 9 mana creature, but it has this incredibly powerful ability, pay 1 life, target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn, which is an incredibly powerful ability because, as we all know, keeping it in the commander format, I'm looking at you, Gristlebrand. Having an ability where all you have to do is pay life and no mana is incredibly powerful. And again, as I've said in the past, if you've never played a commander game with a Kuru Pitlord in play, you don't realize how incredibly powerful that ability is. You just kill anything you want on the board at your leisure, assuming you have a decent amount of life anyway. But this gets problematic. I've had this in my Name is One deck for a long time. I've had it in play many times, and it does get problematic to pay that 4 black. It's not just I throw this giant creature in play and now I just completely take over the game like you would with an Oracle. 0 downside, only upside. So my entire deck becomes just trying to cheat this creature into play. No, I actually have to work around the 4 black mana. It makes it a little difficult for me. I'm totally okay with that. No problem with that at all. Big, scary, powerful creatures used to have downsides. They always had downsides, again, because of the ways you could cheat them into play, right? You could just reanimate them out of your graveyard. If I 1 mana reanimate my Kuru Pitlord into play, well, I still got to figure out a way to play the 4 black. I mean, I can reanimate it into play and then kill all the creatures on board and then just let it go to the graveyard on my upkeep instead of paying the 4 black. Okay, fine. But if I want to keep it in play, I got to figure out how to pay the 4 black. That's why I like those upkeeps. I also have Spirit of the Night in my Name is One deck because, of course, it is a spirit. And this was the OG big scary creature. And this was played a ton in so many different decks. And the reason why is because it was a big scary creature with a whole lot of keyword abilities. 6/5 was considered a really big creature back then, but it had no downsides. This was the first creature printed like that, where it was just all upside, no downside. And so for that reason, it was the go-to. It was the go-to beater in every deck where you wanted that until Achroma came out, right? And then Achroma became an even scarier, harder to kill version of Spirit of the Night. And then that became the norm. That became the creature. And if you just think about Spirit of the Night and Achroma and then compare it to the go-to beater now, which of course is Emrakul, which is, I mean, those guys just pale in comparison, but that is more a power creep thing. I'm not talking necessarily about power creep, although that definitely comes into the whole Magic card design thing. Another thing they brought up in that video, which I think is very relevant in the Commander format. In fact, I think it entirely exists because of the format, which I didn't really think about that much until they brought it up, and I completely agree, is the being able to casting with any color of mana ability. And, I've been talking about this, again, on my channel quite a bit. We see it all the time with Commander cards and obviously in non-Commander cards, but those cards, obviously, the wording is there because it's meant to be played in Commander because Commander players like doing stuff like that, right? So Opposition Agent, again, a very contentious card in the Commander format. While an opponent searching their library, they exile each card they find. You may play those cards for as long as they remain exiled. They should have stopped there. This card would be a lot more fair and a lot less annoying and a lot less powerful if they would have stopped there. But the part that, in my opinion, puts this card over the top is you may spend mana as though or mana of any color to cast them. So all the cards that do that, and of course, again, we see that wording on cards all the time, especially in the Commander format, and it has two issues, okay? Issue number one is it obviously makes the card a lot better. And I know people say, oh, those cards wouldn't be very good if you couldn't cast the stuff you're exiling. Guess you got to be more careful with it then, right? I mean, it makes it less powerful. Is that not a good thing to make cards less powerful? The big issue though, which I hadn't actually thought about before that they brought up in that video, is it's a color pride break. That I don't love. The fact that you can just cast stuff with any color of mana is a color pride break, and there is not a lot of real flavor-wise or card design explanation for that. Why is Opposition Agent allowing you to cast a Krosan Grip? What's the explanation there, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense in the actual mechanics of the game or the flavor of the game. Yes, I've never loved the whole you may spend mana as though we're mana of any color thing. That to me is a color pie break, and I don't love color pie breaks. Again, the color pie break thing has been a little bit of a design flaw in recent times as well. And it certainly is something that I think they've been pushing a lot because of the Commander format. I don't particularly love it. Opposition Agent would be a way more fair and balanced card and not nearly as good if you couldn't just cast whatever you want from your opponent's library. If a card says you may cast it for free, that makes a little more sense to me. I mean, it's obviously a lot better because you don't have to pay for it, but at least flavor-wise, it makes a little more sense if you're just not paying the mana at all, right? I think it does anyway. The fact that you can just spend any color of mana to cast that Krosan Grip doesn't make a lot of sense in the flavor of the game. The other thing they brought up in that video, which I had not really thought about before, but I totally agree with, is the cards that don't allow for interaction. And they specifically brought up Thassa's Oracle, which, again, very pertinent to the Commander format. That's why I want to talk about it here. And of course, before Thassa's Oracle came along, there was Lab Man or Laboratory Maniac, which was the go-to. Used a lot as a win con on a lot of decks, but it was the more fair version of it. And of course, Thassa's Oracle is just straight up better, so why would you ever use Laboratory Maniac? Thassa's Oracle makes it so that the win is instantaneous. Of course, with Laboratory Maniac, you had to draw that card. You had to have your Laboratory Maniac come down, and if your library's empty, obviously that's the game plan there. Now I have to have some trigger that's going to get me to draw a card, and your opponents could respond to it, right? Your opponents could interact. Thassa's Oracle is way harder to interact with. Of course, there are ways. Stifle effects will work. I'm always touting those effects on my channel. Stifle effects will work with a Thassa's Oracle. There are a couple of ways, but rare and not ones you typically see in a Commander deck. You actually have to start shoehorning those cards into your deck in order to deal with it. Now in CEDH, maybe they're already running Angel's Grace and cards like that, so it's less of an issue. But with a Lab Man, I can just respond with any creature removal spell, right? My opponent is going to draw a card with their Laboratory Maniac on the table and their library empty, and I can respond with just a Swords to Plowshares, one of the most popular cards in the entire Commander format. So there's a solution there, and interaction is possible. And as a guy who loves removal and loves interaction, that in particular really does bother me. Making cards where interaction is not a thing. You're taking the interaction out of the game. I don't love it. I'll be honest, I don't love Thassa's or I win the game by drawing my entire library. I don't love that. And I will be talking about that in a future video, because turning a thing that would lose you the game into something that wins you the game, that in itself is horribly problematic and is a huge issue for me. But again, I'll talk about that in a later video. I could continue talking about things. I don't want to complain too much. Again, it's just a Commander design thing or a Magic design thing that specifically affects Commander. They brought up a few really interesting things in that video that I'm like, yeah, I definitely am on the same page as you. I wouldn't say I agree with everything they talked about in that video. I think they're more standard, modern, pioneer, historic, however many formats there are now. They're playing more of those formats. And I'm talking about this card design stuff specifically as a Commander player. You guys let me know in the comments what you think of specific bad designs as far as cards go with Commander or just Magic in general. That is it for today, though, and thanks for tuning in.